All of the interests of my reason, speculative as well as practical, combine in the three following questions. What can I know? What ought I to do? What can I hope? These were the ultimate questions to which Immanuel Kant devoted most of his adult life. He died in 1804. 20 years earlier, he asked and answered a different question in one of his more accessible essays. Was ist Aufklärung? What is enlightenment? And his answer to that question was that enlightenment is synonymous with intellectual freedom, with a special form of maturity that finds one expressing his own authentic ideas rather than echoing the thoughts of others. He put it this way, quote, enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. For enlightenment of this kind, all that is needed is freedom. And the freedom in question is the most innocuous form of all. Freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters, close quote. The question that arises is whether the best way to understand Kantian philosophy is as something of the culmination of Enlightenment thought, or a philosophy that finally brings down the curtain on the Enlightenment, showing that many of its loftier aspirations are simply impossible because grounded in a certain kind of mistake. Well, let's see. Kant wrote three major critical treatises. The so-called first critique is his critique of pure reason. The second is his critique of practical reason. And the third is what he called the critique of judgment. The critique of pure reason, Kritik der reinen Vernunft, the German Kritik is not to be understood as a mere negative appraisal, but as a close analysis intended to reveal the assets and limitations of its subject. In his first critique, then, Critique of Pure Reason, Kant is engaged in a critical examination of the nature and the limits of reason itself, an inquiry into the extent to which we can solve problems of knowledge, the problem of knowledge, in virtue of the rational resources that are available to us. Just what is the reach of reason? What are the limits imposed on reason? And where reason leaves off, well, what else might there be to serve in its place? What else might we have any right to hope for? Similarly, the critique of practical reason. This is an analysis of the grounding of ethics, the principles by which choices are made among morally weighty alternatives. And the critique of judgment affords the same, but now in the context of aesthetics. So here you have in Kant, if I pause for a moment just to sort of encapsulate these three colossal works, an address directly to the problem of knowledge, then the problem of conduct, and then the domain of aesthetics, but the domain of aesthetics in the sense of how we go about making judgments of what is right, what is apt, what is harmonious, what in fact instantiates universal principles, etc. So these are monumental works, all, by the way, extremely difficult in his language and at least in one other, English. Kant himself was well read, but he was not well traveled. There he lived in Königsberg all his life. It's said that he never went more than 50 miles from his front door. A man of very methodical habits. It is well known that people could set their clocks to the time Kant took lunch. He did have a housemaid. There's a student whose memoir records the fact that Professor Kant could be a quite affable and genial host, and that indeed, of all things, Kant had a sense of humor. Now, I should say that evidence of Kant's humor is not abundant in his philosophical writings. But then, as the comedian says, I guess you would have had to be there. If I can just pause one moment, I do know one Kant joke. It may be the only joke that Kant ever told. I don't know. It shows up in his anthropological writings, where he's making a distinction between emotion and passion. Now, passion is something that can rise quickly, it's an unnatural state, etc., as opposed to a rather stable feature of one's personality. And to illustrate the effect passion can have, he says, the young man passionately in love with the lady of his choice sees in her no imperfection whatever. And then comes Kant's only joke, at least the only one I know about. He says this condition of blindness generally clears up about 3 weeks after marriage. So that's the Kant joke. I can guarantee my audience that I shall not attempt another. He may not have either. The Critique of Pure Reason is a work that comes about, Kant says, because he has been awakened from his dogmatic slumbers by whom? By David Hume. Now, Bertrand Russell, writing as bombs were falling on London, would not be very kind to the Prussian Kant, declaring that having been thus awakened by Hume's writings, Kant quickly returned to a state of philosophical somnolence. Well, Kant was awakened to the benefit of all philosophy in general. Now, what is it in Hume that would awaken one from one's dogmatic slumbers? And what's the dogma to which in our slumbers we are more or less attached to or controlled by? Hume had argued convincingly that everything we know is the product of experience, that such a basic concept as that on which all science and inquiry will depend, the concept of causation, is to be understood chiefly as a kind of habitual mode of mental operation. More, that the moral domain, properly understood, is the domain of passion and sentiment, grounded in considerations of self-interest and utility. So this is the stuff of which wake-up calls are made. There is circumstantial evidence supporting the proposition that Kant was well aware of Hume's local critics, especially Reid. He mentions them dismissively in the first critique, thinking that they would try to counter Hume's philosophy by consulting nothing more substantial than, quote, common sense. Now, Kant did not read English, and the translation of Reid's inquiry that would have been available to him had been anonymously translated, by the way. It rendered the term common sense gemeiner Menschenverstand, the way you might talk about a common criminal. So if Kant wanted to have it his way, he could have regarded Hume's critics as relying on gemeiner, common in the sense of very common, vulgar, the usual, do you see, mere consensus, that sort of thing, what the great generality of people happen to have as an opinion. In this, he grossly underestimated Reid. And there were academic political reasons for this, which I shan't go into. Nonetheless, we do know that Kant knew better, and we know that in Kant's time, German scholarship was in regular contact with summaries, redactions of major works in the English-speaking world of philosophy, and by the way, especially the world of Scottish philosophy. So the ink was not long dry on major Scottish treatises before summaries of these works would be available in German. And as it happens, Kant can be shown to have been influenced by Reid. Indeed, there are aspects of Kant's moral theory that more or less track the Reidian notion of moral first principles. This clearly is the subject for another occasion and a much, much closer study than would be called for in a general lecture. Now, getting to Hume. Well, starting with the first critique, Kant agrees with Hume in insisting that all knowledge arises from experience. Obviously, you can't know whether George has his shoes on unless you look and see. This isn't some sort of ratiocinative or introspective procedure for answering questions. Kant says it's a mistake to assume, however, that because our knowledge arises from experience, that our knowledge is grounded in experience. Now, this is a distinction that is fundamental. There is a difference between something arising from something else and something being based necessarily on something else. How does Kant proceed to make the point? Let's begin with Hume's theory of causal concepts. According to Hume, we come to regard A as the cause of B when A and B have been constantly conjoined in experience. That is, when the associative principles of repetition and contiguity and cause and effect have worked their magic. At that point, the mind is so constituted that the inevitable conclusion it reaches is that A is the cause of B. Now, it is not the conclusion of an argument. It's just the habit of the mind. We have the case of billiard balls. Ball 1 hits ball 2. 1 moves. In hitting ball 2, 2 moves. Now, witnessing such conjunctions, says Hume, one cannot see a third term betwixt them. Causation is not visible on the billiard table. Rather, it is an idea formed in the mind as a result of constant conjunctions. Now, this was all rehearsed in my lecture on Hume. All right. Kant recognizes in this account a fundamental and necessary precondition, not addressed by Hume. Billiard ball 1 moves. Then billiard ball 2 moves. That's what succession is all about. First one event, then another event. Now, clearly, that third term this time is then, and it's also not on the billiard table. We can't look at a billiard table and see temporality. We can't see time or feel time. That is to say, there cannot be succession, and therefore there cannot be constant conjunctions unless time is present as a categorical framework for all experience. Time, then, is one of the necessary preconditions for the temporal ordering of events in time itself, and it's not given in any empirical experience. In other words, time is not a stimulus that works on a sense organ. Time cannot be provided by experience. It's not a something out there that stimulates me. In Kant's terminology, cognitive or epistemic holdings that are not the result of experience are referred to as pure. Pure in Kant's sense refers to what is non-empirical. So, a critique of pure reason means a critical examination of the very forms of rationality that could not possibly be provided by experience, but nonetheless constitute the framework within which experience becomes possible. Now, I shall return to this more than once in today's lecture. Now, remaining with Hume's billiard table, we can ask, what else is not given in experience? If Hume refers to something as being seen before him, as in, I see a billiard table before me, well, the question that arises is by what faculty or sense do we come to experience space itself? Space as such is not given in experience. Objects are in space, but space is not a stimulus. It's not an object. What is it then? It's something that must be present for there to be experience at all. All experience presupposes a spatial, temporal framework. There cannot be experience except by way of time and space. Thus does Kant reach the concept of what he calls the pure intuitions of time and space, pure in the sense of non-empirical. Now, intuitions is one of those words which in both German and English can give rise to great confusion. Let's just say that what Kant is referring to is a necessary precondition for something else to come about. He refers to the pure intuitions as being a priori, prior to any and every experience. So the a priori pure intuitions of time and space become the necessary preconditions for there to be experiences of just the sort required by Hume's theory. Now remember, a priori here is not just a matter of prior in time, It's conceptually, logically, something must be for something else to take place. The concept of causation is not simply a habit of the mind, then, based on certain common experiences. The concept of causation must be grounded in something more fundamental and grounded in that which experience itself could not possibly convey. You get the point. Grounded in as distinct from arising from. Now, if time and space are the necessary preconditions for there to be any and all possible experience, are there necessary preconditions for our having any understanding of the world, any understanding at all? Now, Locke's essay on the human understanding says, how comes the mind to be furnished? I answer in a word, from experience. And Locke goes on to argue, as I mentioned in my lecture on Locke, that these complex ideas are formed associatively. Hume carries the notion further in the empiricist tradition. Kant, however, insists that the scheme won't work because it fails to capture the very form of the understanding. Understanding does not take the form of a constellation of merely and haphazardly connected events which just happen to be experienced frequently. No. All of our understanding, all of our knowledge claims, all of the epistemic claims we ever make have certain formal properties about them. That is, they all take place within a categorical framework that includes entities that could not possibly be gained through experience. In that part of the first critique, which Kant calls the analytic of concepts, he seeks to provide the framework for all knowledge. He contends that in all instances, knowledge involves a judgment, and that judgments are formed within a universal categorical framework. It is in the metaphysical deduction, as he calls it, that Kant presents his fourfold table of the pure categories of the understanding. Remember again now, pure means non-experiential, not given in experience, not empirical. So the pure categories of the understanding turn out to be those of quantity, quality, modality, and relation. Now let's begin by considering the category of quantity. All of our quantitative judgments have this in common. They are based either on the concept of unity, or the concept of plurality, or the concept of totality. One, many, all. So, all quantitative judgments answer to that categorical framework. Something is either a unity, a plurality, or a totality. Now, if all you had were fingers and toes, you'd have no trouble with quantities, let's say, up to 20. You'd have no trouble with unity. You'd have no trouble with plurality. But there's nothing about the senses that can convey totality or universality. Everyone knows that there's no number so large that you cannot add one to it, but nobody knows this by counting. If I can pause for a moment and reflect on something of a joke that the cognitive psychologist Piaget years ago made. He said the radical empiricist believes that the series of positive integers was discovered one at a time. Now, past experience will never give one the number infinity. Infinity isn't a number. So you're probably not going to get one if you're not going to get an infinite series by counting. It's not a probability estimate either. Rather, the understanding has this category of quantity within it, which all empirical data seek a place within and an order within. It's a categorical framework that includes unity, plurality, totality. Now consider the category of modality. Something either is actually the case, or it is possibly the case, or it is necessarily the case. Now take the modal category of necessity and think about it for a minute. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then necessarily A is greater than C. If all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, necessarily Socrates is mortal. Now, consider the certainties of logic and mathematics, generative of what we call necessary truths. Is it not obvious that nothing in the world of sensible matter is what it is necessarily? You couldn't possibly get the concept of necessity from sense experience. Nothing experienced in the sensible world is of such a nature that it could not be different. So the concept of necessarily X can't possibly be the gift of experience. It's not an empirical, but a pure category of the understanding. Do you see? Now, it might be argued that what Kant is providing here is merely a list of descriptions that we use for our experiences, and these are seldom reflections of, somehow are reflections of how the brain organizes things. That is, let me pause here to say, suppose you wanted to grant all this much to Kant, but say, look, he couldn't know this, having died in 1804, but what he's really accounting for is the particular manner in which the nervous system processes inputs. Well, although he died in 1804, Kant actually did address the possibility in the first critique, whether the best way to understand the categories of the understanding is in terms of the particular organization we have, the Hume's old constitution of our nature, the kinds of beings we are. But as Kant points out, if that were the case, then the pure categories of the understanding would merely be contingent. That is to say, they would simply be contingently tied to a particular kind of cognitive being. Different brain categories would be entirely different. But Kant has shown through his analysis that all judgment requires a categorical framework necessarily. His theory is not about how we go about describing and ordering things, but the necessary framework for all understanding. It wouldn't matter if you were a Martian or anything else. Quantity, quality, modality, and relation constitute the necessary epistemic framework within which there can be understanding. The pure categories determine the conditions under which there can be any understanding of the world at all. So, it's not a matter of the peculiarities of a particular nervous system. It has to do with the nature of what can be understood and how. The pure categories of the understanding are not themselves generative of content. Kant is not specifying in advance how many quantitative things we can know, or whether we can ever know the difference between something being certainly true or merely highly probable. These constitute the forms of understanding, just as the pure intuitions of time and space constitute the form of experience. What Kant is providing is the form of all understanding, the form of all experience, is by way of the pure intuitions of time and space. The form of the understanding is by the pure categories of the understanding. So Kant is not specifying what experiences we're going to have, only that if there is to be experience, necessarily there must be the pure intuitions of time and space. Similarly, and again, Kant is not specifying what the understanding comes to have, only that the form of all understanding is in terms of the pure categories of the understanding, and these are not empirical. Well, back now to Hume and the wake-up call. Hume may be understood as claiming the following. There are two classes of things we can know about. One class involves the relations among ideas, and the other, matters of fact. Now, this division is sometimes called Hume's fork. When we declare that all bachelors are unmarried men, which is, by the way, necessarily true, we are expressing no more than a relationship between two ideas, namely the idea of bachelor and that of unmarried man. But of course, this is an utterly uninforming truth. It's a mere tautology. It's a truth by definition. Now, propositions where the meaning of the subject term is contained in the predicate term, as in all bachelors are unmarried men, what in philosophy are called analytic propositions, well, this simply shows relationships between ideas. And analytical propositions are true, they're necessarily true, their truth can be known entirely independently of experience, so that we say they can be known to be true a priori. Here's a proposition. Bill is wearing shoes. Now that's a different kind of proposition. There isn't anything in the subject term Bill that includes in the predicate term, in the meaning of the predicate term, wearing shoes. Bill could be shoeless. He could be barefoot. He might not have feet. So this is a claim about the factual content of the world. If you needed a brief summary of Hume's solution to the problem of knowledge, it would be Hume claiming this. Statements of the sort, Bill is wearing shoes, present facts about the world. They are synthetic propositions, and their truth can never be known prior to the relevant observation or experience. Hume insists, then, that no synthetic proposition can be known to be true a priori. That is, any factual statement about the world has as a condition of its truth a relevant observation. You cannot establish its truth prior to some relevant experience, some relevant test. So the Humean epistemology, the Humean solution, as it were, to the problem of knowledge, is that there can be no synthetic proposition whose truth is knowable a priori. Now, Kant's rebuttal is by way of the pure intuitions of space and time, and the categories of the understanding. The form of all experience is given by the pure intuitions of time and space, and the form of all knowledge by the pure categories of the understanding. As this refers to things in the external world, including Bill wearing shoes, all empirical statements that we make will necessarily have certain properties which can be established a priori by way of the pure intuitions of time and space and the pure categories of the understanding. Now let me pause here. What Kant is setting out to establish is that there are some synthetic propositions, the truth of which can be known a priori, namely that whatever experience you're about to have, it takes place within a spatio-temporal framework, and that is going to be a fact of the experience. Now, if that is the case, then I'm able to offer such synthetic propositions as this. Any event that takes place in time, or has a limited duration, or has either a unity or plurality or totality. Now, these are actually going to be statements about real-world events. And described this way, their truth, we might say, is known a priori. The forms of knowledge, like the forms of experience, are not themselves given in experience, but do determine the ordering, organizing, and patterning of all possible knowledge. And so, in a manner of speaking, for Hume to be right, Kant has to be right. That is, the Kantian a priori framework seems to be a requisite in order for Hume's account of causation and knowledge to work. Now, when Kant grants that Hume got this much right, that all of our knowledge arises out of experience, Kant is already recording his modest credentials as an empiricist. And he's also stating his own position to be very much in the patrimony of the ideal theorist, as Reid used the term, from Aristotle on. What we know of the external world factually takes the form of phenomena. Now, phenomena meaning objects of perception. The world known and the world knowable is the world as processed by the organs and principles of perception. But there's got to be something behind this realm of phenomena. And the question is, how accurately, how veridically, how validly does the mental representation of reality that we have reflect the actual reality? Kant here makes a distinction between the world as it's experienced, which is the world of phenomena, and what must stand behind the experience, which he calls the realm of noumena, that noumenal realm of things as in themselves they really are. It is not for us ever to be able to penetrate through the phenomena to the noumenal level. And so there is in this aspect of Kant's philosophy a limit on what we can know and the validity of our knowledge claims. There's a lot of Hume in Kant. There's very little Kant in Hume. But you begin to see what the rationalist rebuttal of a systematic and relentless empiricism looks like. It looks like what Kant serves up in the first critique.